Brian Lehrer on WNYC. We learned yesterday that former Massachusetts Congressman Barney Frank has died at the age of 86. Frank is a significant figure in American history, at least for being the first member of Congress to come out voluntarily as gay. That was in 1987. I say voluntarily because one other member had been involuntarily outed 4 years earlier. Barney Frank was also co-sponsor of the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act, as it was called, which newly regulated the banking industry in 2010 to prevent a repeat of the financial crisis that was underway at the time. Before Frank's passing on Tuesday, he had actually been making some news in his final days by offering a critique of his Democratic Party. As he gave interviews to the New York Times and others, Frank, who was Jewish, told the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, that news organization, that, quote, "I held on longer than I should have," unquote, to the degree to which he supported Israel. He said, quote, "I've been talking about the importance of repudiating positions from the left and from the far left." That's most of what we'll talk about with him, regarding him, by the way. He said, but the Israel one is almost 180 degrees. It's the one area where we are not doing enough. And he said it should be what the Democrats are advocating is giving an ultimatum that Netanyahu either changes things substantially in Gaza and the West Bank, or we cut off any aid, particularly due to what they're allowing to happen in the West Bank, that it is important morally and politically to repudiate the policy of supporting Israel's military activity, unquote, from Barney Frank. But it's the first part of that quote, that he's been repudiating positions from the left and the far left, as he put it, that's been making the most news, given his history as a progressive leader during his time in Congress. Now, to be clear, he's disgusted by Trump, and it's not that he disagrees with the goals of the Democratic left, the way he describes it, but he thinks their strategy is wrong. So he told the New York Times, quote, "The key to liberal democracy being able to come back is to get rid of the perception that we have allowed to grow that the entire Democratic Party is committed to a series of very drastic social reconstructions that go beyond the politically acceptable. The problem with my friends on the left today is that they want these things to be litmus tests immediately. They don't want to spend any time. So what happens is they demand that more mainstream liberals sign on to these things, and then they lose because of it." And then he gives an example. "Male to female transgender sports. That is the most controversial part of the agenda, the equivalent of gay marriage," meaning gay marriage was as he saw it, the end point of the gay rights movement, the culmination of it. "So put it at the end," he says. "If you go at it that way, you build support for it. But if you insist on the most controversial parts all at once, you make it harder." And here's one other example on Medicare for All. Barney Frank told the Times, "I think it would be a better world, a better America, if somehow everybody had Medicare." But they don't. And so something that I think would be very helpful, substantively and politically, is to reduce the age of Medicare to 60 from 65. A lot of families would benefit. You could do it right away and it would work and it would build support for going even further. But the left does not support an increase in Medicare coverage. They want to do something more revolutionary. So, very provocative stuff from Barney Frank in his last days. And I want to play some clips that are relevant to this, because it struck me that Barney Frank had long been advocating progressive incrementalism, I'll call it that, as a pathway to progressive success. He did it, for example, on this show back in 2015. He was here to discuss a memoir he had released that year called Frankly. Here's a 2-minute exchange in which I ask him a question about exactly that. The New York Times review of your book focuses on your pragmatism and defense of incrementalism in public policy to get things done. Do you think too many progressives these days are too dismissive of incremental progress?
Absolutely, because that's the only kind of progress you can have. In particular, one of the things I argue with especially some of my LGBT allies and others is the extent to which they misread the history of the African American movement. Martin Luther King was a great incrementalist. By the way, so was the whole NAACP, etc. Thurgood Marshall, that great man. The first lawsuits Thurgood Marshall and his colleagues brought to the Supreme Court challenging separate but equal did not challenge the existence of the doctrine and say it was blatantly unconstitutional. What they said was, okay, you say separate but equal, but these separate facilities aren't equal, and either you make them equal or you get rid of them. And I've had LGBT people say, well, what we need is one big gay rights bill like the Civil Rights Act of 64. But the Civil Rights Act of 64 did some things and not others. It didn't include voting rights. It didn't include housing. Look, incrementalism is not in other words, nobody has the ability, it seems to me, to choose between doing it a little bit at a time and getting it all. Obviously, the moral case is to get as much as you can. What is the issue is, okay, if as much as you can is less than you would like, ultimately, do you walk away from it or do you take it and build on it?
Of course, Martin Luther King's rhetoric included denunciations of incrementalism, right?
Yes, but people have to understand the context. He was denouncing those white people who were saying, just wait for minds to change. He never objected to getting something specific. There's a very good book by Taylor Branch about him, and he would go here, he would take a couple of steps forward, then he would back off some. He would, and as I said, you just look at the history of the legislation, and it is incremental.
Barney Frank here in 2015. I'll play a few more clips from that interview, and then we'll talk to Jonathan Lemire from The Atlantic and MSNOW about Barney Frank's passing and other things in the news, including Jonathan's new article about how President Trump is aging in office. But one of the things about Barney Frank's visit here in 2015, similar to that news he was making recently, was that he wasn't shy about criticizing leaders from either party at that time, too. Here he is on former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie after the revelations in the Bridgegate scandal.
I was struck by the bridge situation. And I got to tell you, I do not understand why the media they have not yet asked Chris Christie one central question. Christie makes his reputation as a tough prosecutor. He cracks crimes. He gets to the bottom of them. He said when he was told that some of his people might have been involved in that outrageous abuse of power, shutting down the bridge for political retaliation, that he called in the people who'd been accused, asked them if they had done it, and when they said no, he said, that's it. I want to know, when he was a prosecutor, if people were accused of a crime, did he call them in and say, are you guilty? And when they said no, was that the end of it?
Barney Frank on Chris Christie. Donald Trump had not yet entered politics when we did that 2015 interview. It was just weeks later that he would. But this exchange seems kind of relevant today. He was talking about trust in government as an institution cratering after Watergate and the Vietnam War in the 1970s. And I asked him this. What an irony that backlash against Vietnam and Watergate would have driven the country to the right.
Absolutely right. No, and that's one of the lessons I want to give some of my friends on the left. When we are critical of particular government programs, as we often are and should be, we should be careful not to let that bleed into a condemnation of government as general, not to say they're all no good. And I think, frankly, I've said this, that's one of the problems I have with Jon Stewart. The specific complaints Jon Stewart makes about bad policy are accurate, but they blend into a narrative that the government's full of thieves and incompetence and ill-intentioned people.
Barney Frank criticizing Jon Stewart, something I certainly didn't expect to hear in that interview. Frank had a lot of praise for President Obama, who was still in office at that time, but he thought Obama made at least one big strategic mistake at the beginning of his presidency that helped the Republican Tea Party movement rise and the Democrats lose both houses of Congress.
There was one thing I think the president made a strategic error on. I supported his interest in expanding health care, very important, the greatest social need. I believe that we made a mistake. We should have done financial reform first, exactly as you posed as a question. We should have done the tough stuff, regulating the banks, curtailing their influence. I would have done the way it worked. We spent the first year on health care and the second year on financial reform. Yeah. If we had reversed that, we might have been able to alleviate some of the anger. And
one more clip. A caller heard we were talking to a New England Democrat named Barney, and must have thought we were saying Bernie, because if he asked if our guest was going to run against Hillary Clinton in the Democratic primary for president. The response?
Bernie and I don't look alike very much. My hair has grown into his hair color. I have to say, it's partly because it's Bernie and Barney, and it's kind of two Jewish guys from New England. It does not impress me that people make that
Originally
confusion.
from the New York metro area,
Yes.
Now in New England. What do you think about him entering the race?
A great mistake. Bernie, in the first place, I think he made a sensible choice to be kind of an outsider, a critic. He's a socialist. He's not a member of the Democratic Party. It's a totally different role now to say, I want to be president of the United States. Socialism is a perfectly valid doctrine. In fact, given the public opinion in America, is an epithet that is used to kind of undercut some of the things we do. I think Bernie is switching horses a little bit too late. And I also think as this issue, he has stressed his integrity is demonstrated by his refusing to join the Democratic Party. I think it's a mistake in his own terms for him now to make this switch just so he can run for office.
And so maybe that circles back to where we started with Barney Frank's strategic critique of his party to this day for trying to do too much at once. Of course, the more cautious Hillary Clinton did win that nomination, not Bernie Sanders, but as you all know, she did lose the election in the fall. Barney Frank, who died on Tuesday at the age of 86 on this show in 2015. Barney Frank, rest in peace. We'll talk about some of those clips and more after the break with Jonathan Lemire from The Atlantic and MSNOW, including Jonathan's interesting new article about how President Trump is aging in office. Stay with us. Brian Lehrer on WNYC. With us now, Jonathan Lemire, staff writer for The Atlantic and co-host of Morning Joe on MSNOW. He has a new article in The Atlantic, including Jonathan's interesting take on how President Trump is aging in office compared to how President Biden did. It's called A Different Kind of Fading President. Jonathan, always good of you to extend your day after Morning Joe and come on with us. Welcome back to WNYC.
Always glad to be here.
And listeners, anything you want to raise with Jonathan Lemire about national politics right now? Maybe you read his article on how President Trump is fading, as he puts it, compared to President Biden, or maybe you want to chime in with a remembrance of Barney Frank as an appreciation or a critique of some of the things he was saying in those clips and saying in his recent interviews, whatever you want to do. 212-433. WNYC 212-433-9692. Call or text. And Jonathan, first on Barney Frank, you heard those clips from 2015 and you saw the news he had made in his final interviews while in hospice care. Are other Democrats in Washington reacting to his critique of trying to go too far, too fast on changes in law and culture and losing elections as a result? Or are they shrugging like Barney Frank isn't relevant anymore, I don't have to say anything about this?
I think at this point, they're mostly just extending their condolences, and remembering Barney Frank as a colorful and sharp-tongued character in an extremely successful legislature. And of course, as you've been noting, a historic figure in the Congress. But I think even if it's not Frank in particular, what he had to say, Frank gave voice to a debate that is roiling the Democratic Party as we speak, and frankly has for a few years now. The party clearly moved to the left during the first Trump term and during 2020 in particular, during the COVID pandemic, during the summer of unrest after the George Floyd killing. And there were, on a number of issues, became more progressive. And we saw that, that was to their electoral detriment per a lot of polling in 2024. So now the party is wrestling with, well, where do we go from here? And I think Frank is, it's so striking to me that in these series of interviews and frankly, in his dying days and in a book that's coming that he wrote, he thought this was so important for causes, for the party he believes in and causes he championed. He thought it was so important to issue that warning that Democrats risk going too far. And that is what some have been saying, particularly since November 2024, that right now they need to temper some of these stances to get more in line with the middle of sort of the American public, in part to make sure they win elections. The principles are one thing, but they can't be put into practice if you don't hold power.
You know, I wonder if you think the Barney Frank then and now critique indicates that the Republican Party has changed more than the Democratic Party in the Trump era. Trumpism basically rules the GOP, right? We saw that in the recent spate of primaries in which some of the very few Republicans who criticized Trump on anything lost their seats. Bill Cassidy, Thomas Massie, those state senators in Indiana who didn't vote to gerrymander. While there are so many Democratic primaries this year in which it's genuinely competitive between more progressive and more centrist or incremental, if we want to call it that, candidates.
No, I think that's right. I think the Democratic Party, right now, there's a robust debate about ideas. I think that's sort of healthy for the party. Although I note that the timing here is interesting because while you were actually playing those Barney Frank interview clips, the DNC finally released its long-delayed, quote, autopsy of what wrong in 2024 that Ken Martin, the DNC chair, had shielded, had not put out in the public. Just a few minutes ago, he finally did. So it's a party that's still very much wrestling with where it needs to be and where it needs to go. The Republican Party is an extraordinary different place. It has compromised many of its long-held beliefs, some of its core tenets in service of Donald Trump. He has remade them. The Republican Party of today in 2026 is almost unrecognizable in many ways from the Republican Party of, say, 15 or 20 years ago, certainly of 25 or 30 years ago. And so much of it is now simply Trump's whims. And you're certainly right to highlight this idea that though Trump in polls for a entire electorate, national polls, he's in the upper to mid 30s. This is as low as he's ever been. Some polls 35, 34. These are terrible numbers. But yet, despite that, despite Republicans, looking at those polls, and you could certainly think that they would believe they'd be in big trouble come November, yet his grip on the GOP remains as tight as ever. And you tallied the Republicans who he defeated in the last couple of weeks, and leaving very, very few in the national party who have any authority, who still have the ability to speak out against him.
You kind of broke some news there at the beginning of that answer about Ken Martin, the Democratic Party chair, releasing this autopsy report, what went wrong in the 2024 election, in which, of course, President Trump was reelected and the Republicans took both houses of Congress. This has been, I think, a particular source of criticism to the Democratic Party, leadership, and to Martin in particular, from the left flank of the Democratic Party that wanted that autopsy public. So if that just came out a little while ago, have you been able to get a look at it yet to see if they lean more toward, we should have been more centrist or we should have been more left or any other way they framed it?
Well, first, I think it's so striking that Martin himself says, first of all, he apologized for not putting this report out sooner. And in the statement that came with it, said he does not believe the report is up to standards for public consumption. But yet there has been such pressure to release it that he felt like it was time to just put it out there. I mean, I'll be candid. This came out just as we're speaking. I've only glanced at the top line. I haven't had a chance to dive in yet. But I think that this will be eagerly anticipated. Now, look, there's a limit to what these autopsies really will tell us. I think many in the party are going to really groan that the 2024 election is being put center stage at all. That right now the party feels, we remember, Brian, and we talked soon after the election, just how despairing Democrats were. There was open debate. Are we a feasible party anymore after what happened in November of 2024? And that sort of malaise lasted for a few months, but it's gone. Democrats did well in the fall 2025 elections. They have done extremely well in the one-off special elections we've seen so far this year. Polls show they're poised to do very well this November. So I think there are a lot of Democrats who want to just move on from 2024, at the very least, not have it become a major news story. And we should note there's also limited utility. The most famous political autopsy for this one, I might argue, is what the Republicans put out in 2012. And the conclusion of that, after Mitt Romney lost to Barack Obama, is that the party needed to be more inclusive and friendlier to immigration, among other reforms.
And they went just the other way.
And where did it lead them? It led them to Donald Trump, who couldn't have been more opposite of that.
Right. So an autopsy committee from the Republican Party leadership, sees things one way, and then the maverick candidate comes along and actually has a better grasp of what's going to galvanize their grassroots. Julian Hastings wants to talk back to one of the things that Barney Frank said to the New York Times just before he died. Julie, you're on WNYC. Hi.
Oh, thanks for taking my call, and thanks for the segment. Yes, when I read, and I hate to say this because he's such a towering figure and we lost him, but when I read his last article, and he's talking about the need to be incremental and reach the average American, and not call for Medicare for all. Don't try and push Medicare for all. It's too extreme. I don't understand that. I mean, for years, 60% of Americans have been in favor of Medicare for all. Isn't that centrist if the vast majority have been for Medicare for all? I always wondered why the Democrats wouldn't put that. Well, the Democrats who put it forward actually have been winning, like AOC and Plattner in Maine is ahead, and they're calling for Medicare for all. And so I just wonder what we mean by the term incremental.
Julie, thank you. Jonathan, anything for her? I think maybe we defined incremental well enough, but she does, I think, accurately point to polls that show Medicare for all is fairly popular when Americans get asked.
That's certainly true. I think, though, that there have been times where Democrats have been, and let's say this clearly, Republicans as well, but she's focused more on the Democrats here, who have been guilty of overreach. I think that was, we're thinking about 2024 right now, that the Biden years, that there were some who feel like he overinterpreted his own mandate. And again, let's be clear. I say this frequently. The first 2 years of Joe Biden's term legislatively were extremely successful, a remarkable amount of accomplished. But he and those around him wanted to invoke comparisons to FDR and to LBJ, these sweeping years-long programs, and the American people, they weren't quite sure for that. They voted for him in 2020, but as much as it was a vote for Joe Biden, it was just as much a vote against Donald Trump. So I think there is, and I think that was misinterpreted. So I think their incrementalism, I think, was voiced by many to just be like, yes, progress, but steady progress, slow progress. Take bite-sized bites. And that is frustrating to some who feel like we should be taking bigger swings, as the Democrats, in this case, their voice. But I think that there are times where that has backfired.
Jonathan Lemire from The Atlantic and MSNOW. So let's talk about your article in The Atlantic, A Different Kind of Fading President. As Trump will turn 80 next month, why did you decide to compare Donald Trump and Joe Biden on how they're aging in the White House?
With that birthday looming, there have certainly been just more questions about President Trump's health and fitness for office in recent weeks. We see the images with some frequency of him falling asleep in public in the Oval Office. We see the mysterious bruises on his hands. It's obvious to anyone who spends any time around him or just watches him frequently, he moves slower than he used to. And I actually have been thinking for a while, why is Trump's aging process being perceived so differently than Joe Biden's aging process? I mean, the subject of Biden's age consumed Washington and the press corps and became national discussions for years. With his aides insisting he, was still very much fit for office, pointing to that accomplished legislative record, and Republicans suggesting otherwise, and even some Democrats having doubts about the wisdom of Biden running again, but largely keeping those doubts to themselves until, of course, we saw what happened in that general election debate in Atlanta. But I think it's different because Biden, the changes were more obvious, right? He became very thin, almost frail at times. He moved incredibly slowly. His voice was reduced to a gentle whisper. He just appeared very differently than he was as, say, vice president, not even 10 years earlier. For Trump, the argument's always been like, well, he's always been crazy, so therefore, what's the change here? And I think Trump masks some of this because he's a big presence. He's a huge guy, 6'3". He claims 224. We can doubt that. And he's
a little more than that.
Yeah, I think so. He's loud and he fills a room, and because he gives these long speeches, and his aides like to brag about his stamina and his energy. It's easier for them to sort of gloss past it. But when you actually, especially of late, when we see some of his erratic behavior with these, the not just the insults to reporters, but frankly the apocalyptic threats to Iran, I think it is starting a conversation about his own health and fitness for office. And I felt like it was time to take a look in this piece.
No matter what anyone thinks of his policies or if he's nodding off at events sometimes, and I hear you going in a different direction to ask sort of, is he becoming unhinged? He does seem to be not only ever present, but very aggressively engaged in so much policy and politics, pushing hard in the primaries and redistricting, starting the wars in Iran and Venezuela, now the arrest warrant for Cuba's leader, Raul Castro, which suggests to some that Cuba may be next. We're going to do a separate segment on that tomorrow, and I could go on. So can we say that this president is fading, to use your headline's word? And hasn't he always been somebody who, in his version of Art of the Deal, talks a grandiose game?
Well, I'll read just a couple lines from my piece. Trump's genius is in capturing attention. Biden's public schedule grew sparse, and he actively avoided generating news. Trump holds multiple events in front of the press nearly every day. He fills Americans' TV screens and social media feeds seemingly nonstop with an almost unspoken message. How could he be fading if he's everywhere? So there's no doubt he and Biden very different in this way. But I do think what we have seen, his recent behavior is prompting questions. And this includes among some Republicans who are doing so, mind you, very quietly, about his stability, judgment, and mental sharpness. He's always been prone to making gaffes. He's always been prone to making mistakes. They have picked up. His speeches are longer and more meandering with more strange tangents. He's becoming, as someone put to me, more disinhibited. Like, he's never been someone who's had much of a filter, let's be clear. But even now, it's very clear he says whatever he wants. And he is so consumed with his own power and feels like he doesn't have any consequences, but that doesn't necessarily lead to stable leadership. And there are Republicans, and this is something I did hear within his own party, who really question his priorities, that they think that as he ages, that he is more and more consumed with just what he wants, whether it's, a foreign intervention or legacies to himself, like the ballroom and the arch and things like that. And he no longer seems to really care about what the American people think, or frankly, what Republicans need to be successful at the ballot box.
Let me get a couple of more Barney Frank calls in here. People are definitely lining up on either side of, his calling for more incrementalism, for more political success. We had one on who thought he was wrong-headed in that. Here is, let's see, Francesca in the Bronx on the other side of that equation, I think. Francesca, you're on WNYC. Hi.
Hi, good morning. I have two things to say. One is I've been in New York 20 years, but I grew up in Boston, and I was about 16 when Barney Frank came out. And younger people won't really have a context for understanding how brave that was and how strong he is and how much of a pioneer he was, because they were saying at the time it was just political suicide and all of this. It was a completely different time. And he was just heroic as far as I'm concerned. So I love him. As far as the policies go, I support everything he says. But I think there's a big difference between incrementalism and centrism. They're not the same thing. I think I do, and I think he did, have the heart of a far lefty liberal, but the mind of a pragmatist, and it's like Moneyball, right? Like, he gets on base. It might not be, sorry for the sports metaphor, but it might not be the sexiest thing, but you get the next step, you get where you're going. And to sort of cancel or cast aside people who aren't going to do exactly the leftiest, sexiest thing. I'm all for the leftiest, sexiest thing, but that's not how, like, getting it done, actually getting it done, not just talking, but getting it done. That's not how life works, and that's not how government works.
Francesca, thank you very much. And one more in a text. On the other side of that, listener writes, I think Barney Frank, the listener wrote Bernie Frank. There's that again. I think Barney Frank may have forgotten the historical realities in his nostalgic retrospective. It is not unusual for aged activists to look back and critique the sense of urgency expressed in their salad days. Interesting way of looking at it. Jonathan, we only have about a minute left. I want to come back to Trump and ask you this question from the news of the week. You know, there's this $1.8 billion fund the president has now created in a deal with his own Justice Department to compensate what he calls victims of the weaponization of government. This also includes language specifically exempting Trump himself and his family businesses from any reviews of their tax returns that may have been underway. So my last question to you today is, do Republicans in Congress seem to care about that kind of self-dealing, I think we can call it, in an election year, or do they overwhelmingly say it's, you know, just a defense against the deep state going after Trump, or make other excuses for him?
It's pretty galling, and I do think it's gone to the point where some Republicans in the Senate do think it's gone too far. First of all, that IRS protections are for be in perpetuity, like they'd be forever. Never could the finances of President Trump, his family, or his businesses be audited or examined, which is extraordinary. And there's some question of whether it's legal. And then the slush fund for victims of weaponization, and their words, but it could include those who stormed the Capitol on January 6th. The acting Attorney General Todd Blanche has not ruled that out repeatedly. It could include members of Trump himself and his own family. There are some Republicans in the Senate who don't think this is a great idea. Now, it's legislative. Its future remains unclear. It's uncertain what they will do about it. But Thune and others have said, this might be too much. Democrats, as you might imagine, are raising a real stink about this. And it is. It's just that we've never seen a president behave in this way. The self-dealing, as you say, that's the right phrase. And it's interesting that even as Trump clearly has a vice grip on the Republican Party, we're seeing in these primaries, there are a few issues where lawmakers in the GOP are willing to stand up to him. This slush fund being one, and we are getting some real pushback on taxpayer funding, that $1 billion for the ballroom. That's another. So there are a few places where the GOP is saying no. We'll see what Trump's counter move will be.
Jonathan Lemire is co-host of Morning Joe on MSNOW, 6 to 10 a.m. Eastern Time, and a staff writer for The Atlantic. His new article in The Atlantic is A Different Kind of Fading President. Joe Biden became quieter while Donald Trump grows even louder. Thanks for sharing it with us, Jonathan. Always appreciate it.
Thank you. Let's do it again soon.